Into the mic. Just want to welcome you all to the first seminar, IRDR seminar of the year. This is a special seminar to be given by Professor Frank Furedi. I just say that afterwards we'll have a reception. So the reception is in the South Cloisters, and you're all most welcome to come over and join sort of a welcome event as well. So Frank's talk is going to be what's different about this disaster, a sociological perspective on COVID. Frank is a sociologist, commentator, and prolific author. He's been widely cited for his views on why Western societies find it so difficult to engage with risk and uncertainty. So he'll talk for a while, and then there'll be questions later on. But he says that if you want to interrupt and ask a question, you're most welcome to do that. We don't have a roving mic here, so if you ask a question, do please speak up so that your question is then captured. Because we're recording this, you're probably aware many students are still maybe not arrived yet, so we'll be watching this on a recording later on. Okay, so over to Frank.
Thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be speaking to human beings rather than to a Zoom camera, which has been my fate for a while. I want to talk a bit about COVID, and as a sociologist, I'm particularly interested in the social cultural dimensions of the trends that emerged in the course of COVID. And although I haven't got time to go into all aspects of it, because a lot of things happened in the last 18 to 20 months that are well worth studying. As a general rule, one of the things that it's possible to conclude is that almost every single trend that emerged in the course of COVID was anticipated beforehand. In other words, the pandemics can be seen as a catalyst that brings to the surface social and cultural trends that pre-existed it. And it gave it a much more clearer, tangible form than beforehand. I think it's also the case that in some instances, the intensification of the pre-existing social trends during the course of the pandemic actually became so heightened that they began to acquire a dynamic of their own. They almost mutated into something a little bit different. And I'll talk about those later on in the lecture. I suppose you could argue that from a global point of view, the COVID pandemic is quite an unprecedented experience. It's something that is very unique in terms of its overall global impact, quite unlike any other disaster or catastrophe that humankind has known, particularly in the modern era. And I think the reason for that isn't because of the scale of the loss. I think when you're looking at a disaster like a pandemic, it's often tempting to make sense of it by looking at its corrosive, destructive impact. And it is true that the scale of human lives that were lost is quite considerable. As I'm speaking, we're I think globally around almost 5 million deaths that are due to COVID in some shape or form. But I think if you want to have a sense of perspective, the 5 million lives lost pale into insignificance compared to the almost 50 million lives that were lost in the 1918 flu pandemic. So, when you think of the scale of loss as a disaster event, you have to bear in mind the context, the precedent, and you have to be making historical comparisons to give real meaning to what has happened. I think the reason why I would argue that the COVID experience, the coronavirus pandemic, is so unique and is quite unprecedented isn't because of the scale of loss, But I think it's unique because of the confusions, particularly the moral confusions and disorientations that it gave rise to. But it's very, very clear to me, looking at COVID, is that society, particularly Western societies, were morally, intellectually, politically unprepared or lacked the resources to deal with a catastrophe of this scale. And one of the symptoms of what I see as being an inability of Western societies to give meaning, and that's very important because communities need to give meaning to their experiences, but the failure to give meaning to COVID can be seen by the fact that, unlike in many other disasters, which is typically ones where people react with solidarity, where communities come together, COVID was a little bit different. If any of you studies the history of disasters, and if you look at the research that's been carried out in previous community responses to disasters, you will often find that communities react with an unusual degree of solidarity. You will often find that the way communities react is one that you can almost call therapeutic, where people, in a sense, have kind of come together, they watch each other's back, and they actually forge new relationships, which become important even after the disaster is finished, even in the post-disaster situations. I think COVID, I found, was very, very interesting. It was almost the opposite. So although you had, in this country, people clapping almost ritualistically on Thursday nights for the NHS, you had a lot of other counterexamples from a large section of British society being prepared to snitch on their neighbors and to turn over people who lived in their communities to the police, which is anything but an act of solidarity, to a wide variety of ways in which blaming and finger-pointing became institutionalized. And in some parts of the world, particularly in the United States, the situation was really, really bad, because there what you had was a dramatic intensification of the politics of identity, where major clashes between different groups of people in the United States, particularly around the Black Lives Matter movement, but also around issues as to whether or not to wear a mask, erupted in numerous instances. And the very fact that something as trivial as wearing a mask could be so politicized, where people could take such hard positions in a kind of polarized sense against one another, indicated that in some shape or form, at least in the United States, the culture wars seamlessly intertwined with the reaction to the pandemic. And I think that's a very interesting, very unusual situation. But I would argue that in a more limited way, there were similar tensions and conflicts, and ones that are still continuing in other parts of the world. So it was by no means entirely confined to the American experience. One of the things that I think I want to come back to time and again is the background to the pandemic, and something that becomes increasingly important was, in a sense, a decades-long era of social and cultural anxiety. I think we live in an era where even a long time before the outbreak of the pandemic, anxiety and insecurity were so powerful that, as I wrote in my book recently, How Fear Works, the insecure way of looking at the world led to a situation where safety itself became the foundational value, the foundational norm in much of the Western world, where safety was seen as being inherently something that was a good in and of itself, something that had almost like a foundational moral quality. And one of the effects of that was that in the years leading up to the pandemic, what we know as public health, what we kind of call public health, gradually expanded. The meaning of public health gradually expanded from what it used to be. And if any of you studies health, global health issues, you'll find that health and the definition of what health is expands and expands and expands until it doesn't just simply mean what it used to, where you're physically ill, you got a chronic illness. It's about well-being, it's about mental health, it's about sexual health. It kind of expands to the point at which virtually every domain of human experience has become medicalized, or at least is kind of interpreted through the prism of health. And in a sense, I think what has happened, and this is something that I'm writing a series of essays on, is that in the course of the pandemic, what we had was a situation where public health became politicized. Public health became essentially the main medium through which political disputes were conducted. And just as public health became politicized, so at the same time, politics became medicalized. And politics became increasingly sort of one that interpreted the world through to that kind of prism of medicine. Now, early traces of this outlook were already evident in the 1970s, and one important social commentator, the American commentator Christopher Lasch, described this process whereby public health is expanding and where the medicalization of public life becomes increasingly discernible. He talked about how, in particular in the United States, you had the emergence of an ideology that he called survivalism, where survivalism, surviving, became seen as something of an everyday issue, where literally every negative experience was becoming increasingly redefined as a problem of existence, as an existential crisis, where you had a conceptual leap from a small catastrophe in a very localized setting to one that's thought as being a threat to the planet, to the world. I think there are a number of reasons why survivalism came to the fore and has gradually gained momentum in the decades since. Probably to kind of explain it in shorthand, it was very much bound up with the end of ideology, the loss of ideological inspiration in public and political life, where all of a sudden, all the main ideologies of modernity, from communism to socialism to liberalism to conservatism, all of these ideologies lost their capacity to motivate. And as the ideologies lost their way, as religion declined, as people began to become estranged from science, so people's insecurities became heightened, and survivalism and the worship of safety as something that was important in and of itself acquired a tremendous importance. And I think that what we saw, certainly during the pandemic, is the emergence of a very interesting notion that seemed to be the product of the pandemic, but already existed beforehand, which is the idea of non-ending emergencies. I think you're going to come across this in a lot of the literature on disasters, where emergencies are no longer seen as one-off. You have a pandemic, we then kiss COVID goodbye and everything is okay. Increasingly, what we have is the projection of non-ending emergencies into the indefinite future. By the way, the discussion on non-ending pandemics and non-ending emergencies actually parallels the rhetoric and the narrative that was used in the post-9/11 era, where after the 9/11 era, the American government talked about a non-ending global war. Terrorism is a non-ending war that sort of goes into the future. And poor old Joe Biden tried to get around it by pulling out of Afghanistan and acknowledging a humiliating defeat. But the idea of a non-ending war against terrorism still persists just as much as the idea of a non-ending emergencies. If you pause for a second and think about the implications of what that means, we are talking in a very fatalistic sense about a very pessimistic view of the future, right? If our existence is continually put to question by a particular way of looking at the world, then it's very difficult to sort of imagine a kind of a positive, transformative way out of the catastrophes or the pandemics that we experience. And I think this fatalism is particularly summed up by the idea that from this standpoint, it's not human society, but a virus who will determine humanity's future direction of travel. I think that's one of the most shocking, to me at least, being a man of the Enlightenment, one of the most shocking developments that has emerged, to which a lot of policymakers, a lot of scientists, a lot of behavioral scientists in particular, and others have signed up to. The idea is our future is determined by the virus and its mutation into whatever form in the future, rather than what we do, rather what human beings do, the kind of policies that we implement, the kind of scientific innovations we make as a result of that. So in that sense, what we have is a very powerful mood of fatalism that has kicked in under the surface in the course of the pandemic, which I think is quite interesting, given the fact that, you know, that you could very easily give a totally different interpretation, simply in virtue of the fact of recognizing the incredibly important scientific innovations that medical science and the pharmaceutical industry has been complicit in. And the very fact that we managed to, in a sense, create vaccinations at a record time and innovate in a way that does indicate that actually our future can just as much be in our hands, can just as much be a product of the human imagination as that of a virus. But I think that the very fact that this way of looking at things tends to be on the margins of our society is quite symptomatic of what's really going on. As a sociologist, one of the things that I'm particularly concerned with is our reluctance to take a long view of what's happening at the moment. I don't think you can understand the distinctive features of this pandemic unless you compare it and contrast it to the way that previous pandemics were engaged with and experienced in other historical times. So, for example, if you look at what I think is one of the most interesting sort of alternative comparisons to the pandemic, which is the 1918 influenza pandemic, which was the greatest catastrophe from a pandemic point of view in the modern era, you are struck by some very important differences that have gone singularly unnoted in the current discussion. So back in 1918, there was no global media, there was no social media that would bring every single death and every incident involving the catastrophe into your living room. Right? In 1918, you didn't have a situation where literally sort of the catastrophe sometimes acquired the quality of a reality television program, where you saw in front of your eyes some of the terrible events that were occurring, to the point at which what was happening in Bergamo, Italy, was seen by us here in England in a very personal, immediate kind of a way. I think that was very, very important. And it's also the case that for a variety of reasons, people going through the 1918 catastrophe, where millions and millions and millions of people were dying, were actually distracted from the COVID. I mean, can you imagine? I mean, for those of you that live in Britain, you will know that for about 18 months, we talked about nothing but COVID. Absolutely nothing. You know, every item of news was directly or indirectly COVID related. Occasionally, we'll have a few news items intrude, but this was like the COVID era. There was no distraction from that. In 1918, people worried about a lot of other things. They were worried about the rise of radical movements in the United States. They were worried about the implications of the First World War. Many people were worried whether their economic well-being was going to be maintained, what kind of quality of life that they would have. And the smallpox, the influenza epidemic tended to be by no means the main focus of their attention. And unlike today, the pressure on government to be seen to be doing something was relatively modest. This morning, I was listening to the Today program on the BBC, where they were reporting on the parliamentary committee's report on how the British government handled the COVID. And I thought that was quite interesting that the Today program was encouraging people who lost loved ones to come on the Today program in order to point the finger at the government. So you would have this woman come on the program and say, "I blame the government for the death of my husband." Another person comes on the Today program, "I blame the government